In the spring of 1733, as the morning mist dragged like pale fingers across the hollows of the Tennessee frontier, a stranger came to Hollow Creek, a forgotten Appalachian settlement wedged between forest and superstition. The villagers, no more than 30 souls, lived hard and prayed harder, their lives stitched together by threadbare sermons and the rustle of oak leaves whispering ghost tales at dusk. They had not seen a preacher since Reverend Caleb died of fever 2 winters past, and his chapel had burned down 6 months later in what some claimed was an act of God and others whispered was punishment for hidden sin. So when Elijah Marewood appeared at the edge of town, dressed in a long black coat that shimmered like oil and bearing a Bible whose corners were singed as if by fire itself, the people watched in stunned silence. He said little at first, only that he had heard the call, that God had guided him through fog and flame to shepherd the lost. His voice, even in brevity, was a strange mix, low and soothing, but edged with something metallic, something that made children stare and dogs cower. He carried no possessions but a lantern with a flickering amber flame that never went out, even as wind and rain lashed at it during his long walk through the hills. When old Matthew Wansley asked if he came from the east, perhaps Knoxville or even Charleston, Elijah smiled but offered no answer, only saying, "I come from where light has no shadow." The townsfolk, too starved for guidance to press further, welcomed him with the caution of hungry animals offered bread by a cloaked hand-dot. The first service was held atop the foundation stones of the ruined chapel. No one had dared rebuild since the fire, but Elijah said that God did not need walls to hear confession. He told them to come by night, that truth was clearest when shrouded in darkness, and so the people obeyed. She asked him where he had learned such things, and he smiled with wide eyes, replying, "Father Marewood says they're angel words." Sarah told him not to speak them aloud, but he would whisper them in his sleep, and sometimes his candle, the one Elijah had given him, would be lit in the morning even though she had snuffed it before bed. Other children began bringing wax figurines to gatherings, shaping them into vague forms with hollow eyes. Elijah praised their creativity. "The wax remembers the warmth of the soul," he said, "and through it we can speak to the holy fire." He began requesting more private sessions with the 9 chosen, those he called the flame-bearers, and asked their parents' permission to take them on pilgrimages into the woods. He said the children needed solitude to feel God's breath in the trees and hear the hymns of the unburnt. The parents hesitated, but Elijah's calm voice and their own hunger for divine favor always prevailed. Signs began to multiply. Animals found mutilated in the forest, arranged in spirals, trees marked with wax crosses that hardened unnaturally even in summer heat. On several mornings, villagers awoke to find small piles of soot at their thresholds, sometimes shaped like hands. A fever swept the village that autumn, but spared the families of the 9 flame-bearers. Elijah claimed it was proof of God's protection. "As long as their candles remain lit," he said, "the shadow cannot touch you." He warned them never to let the flame go out. Sarah, growing uneasy, began to question him openly. "Is it not dangerous to put such faith in children?" she asked one evening after service. Elijah turned to her slowly, smile unfazed, and said, "It is not the children in whom we place faith, Miss Wansley. It is the fire they carry within them." His answer chilled her more than the night air. She began to follow him in secret, slipping. As winter crept in, Elijah declared the arrival of a sacred season, the cleansing Advent. He said the old year must be burned away to prepare for divine rebirth. The 9 children were dressed in white robes and paraded through the town holding their eternal candles. "They are our offering," Elijah proclaimed, "our hope, our proof that innocence may yet survive this dark world." At night, the chapel ruins glowed with light again, not from torches or hearths, but from within. No one was permitted to enter during these ceremonies, but muffled chanting could be heard, rhythmic and otherworldly. Sarah's son Tobias began to fade, his skin pallid, his eyes sunken. He told his mother he dreamed of fire every night, that he stood in it, and it didn't hurt. and Father Merwood stood beside him, smiling with eyes made of flame. One morning she awoke to find Tobias missing. The front door had not been opened, yet outside on the step was a single burning candle and a small, perfect handprint in ash. Sarah screamed until her voice cracked. The village gathered, but Elijah was nowhere to be found. She begged them to search the woods, the chapel, the caves. They humored her, but found nothing. Days later, Tobias returned, pale, barefoot, and dazed. He said nothing but clutched a melted candle to his chest. When Sarah questioned him, he merely whispered, "The light remembers me." That night, Elijah returned as if nothing had happened, and Tobias refused to leave his side again. As the year ended, a subtle fear had wrapped itself around Hollow Creek like a serpent in hibernation. The people still prayed, but their prayers had shifted, from asking for blessings to pleading for protection. Sarah no longer slept soundly. Her son no longer smiled. And Elijah Merwood, the preacher with no past, no church, and no end to his lantern's flame, now stood at the center of their lives, calling D. By the first thaw of 1734, when the frost began to lift from the grass in Hollow Creek, and the woods exhaled their cold breath in steaming gusts at dawn, something had shifted. Subtly at first, like the tilt of a portrait before a storm shakes the walls, but soon it rotted the air like the smell of candle smoke in a sealed room. The 9 children, once paraded as symbols of divine promise by Elijah Merwood, had grown pale and quiet, their faces drawn and their eyes unfocused, as if they were staring into something none of their parents could see. They rarely spoke during the day and disappeared for long stretches at night, returning with wax on their fingers and ash in their hair. Some parents questioned them, but the answers were always dreamlike. We were in the light. We were with the others. Or, Father Merwood showed us the flame door. Sarah Wainsley watched her son Tobias closely, and each day he grew further from the child she had known, once curious and laughing, now slow in movement, blank in expression, and prone to muttering strange incantations under his breath while turning a stub of candle between his fingers. When she confronted Elijah, asking what had happened during Tobias's disappearance the winter before, he smiled with that same infuriating calm, the kind that poured like syrup over coals, and said, "The boy has been marked for light, Miss Wainsley. He walks between now." That night she dreamt of fire consuming the chapel's ruins, except the fire burned downward, into the earth, not upward into heaven. Soon after the thaw, the first child vanished completely. Elise Moran, the blacksmith's niece, who had carried the third of the 9 white candles. She had gone to gather eggs from the chicken coop and never returned. A neighbor swore she'd seen Elise wandering barefoot through the fields near dusk, wearing her white robe and humming a low, tuneless melody. Her candle, perfectly whole and unburnt, was found standing in a circle of stones behind the chapel. Elijah addressed the village, warning that the darkness is jealous of light, and that only fire can keep it at bay. He blamed the disappearance on shadow eaters, spiritual forces that seek to devour innocence unless it's offered willingly to the light. His words didn't quite make sense, but in a town terrified by whispers and plague, they didn't need to. In Elise's absence, Elijah doubled down on ritual. The chapel's remnants were cleared and rebuilt, mostly underground. He called it the Flame Chapel and barred entrance to all but those chosen by the 9 flames. Only the remaining 8 children were seen going in and out regularly, sometimes carrying buckets of wax or dragging cloth bundles behind them. He began referring to his followers not as townsfolk, but as the Candlelight congregation, and insisted that Hollow Creek must be reborn through trial, its sins seared away in a holy cleansing. "We do not bury our sins," he said in one sermon. "We melt them. We burn them clean." Sarah began her own private inquiry, though it felt more like a descent into madness. She returned night after night to the fields, the woods, the edges of the chapel, looking for signs of where Elise might have gone. Once, she found a pile of scorched dolls near the old root cellar, each with wax eyes and burnt limbs. Another time, she unearthed a buried bundle wrapped in a child's robe. It was filled with candle stubs and pages from a journal soaked in wax, scrawled in a language she did not recognize. She brought the bundle to the constable, but he only sighed and shook his head. "The preacher says we're in a holy season," he muttered, avoiding her eyes. "And if the Lord is working strange miracles, who are we to interrupt?" Sarah felt something crack inside her that day. Not fear, but rage. The town, once her home, was no longer hers. It belonged to fire, to silence, and to the man with the lantern who never stopped smiling. Then the second child vanished. Isaac Bell, the youngest of the 9, was only 7. His father found a trail of wax drippings leading from the family's cabin to the woods, ending at a small cave mouth hidden behind a dead oak. Inside were melted candles stuck to the walls like tumors, and black handprints smeared across the rock in a spiral pattern. Elijah insisted that Isaac had been taken by the same darkness that claimed Elise, and that the remaining 7 children must burn brighter to protect the village. He added more rituals. Each family was instructed to light 3 candles at dusk and keep them burning until dawn. Failure to do so would invite the hunger. Children not among the flame-bearers were forbidden from leaving their homes after sunset. Still, some parents allowed their children to sneak out, believing that service to Elijah would bring blessings. They believed this even when the 3rd child vanished. Leah Benton, who had once been the liveliest of the group, was last seen walking calmly into the woods, her robe trailing behind her, dragging a candle in her hand. By midsummer, the village was in a spiritual fever. People stopped farming, stopped teaching their children anything not approved by Elijah. His sermons grew longer, his language more arcane. He began referencing a coming cleansing of the old flesh, and spoke of the 9 as vessels of living light, whose glow must not be corrupted by touch, by voice, or by sorrow. Sarah could barely eat. Tobias no longer spoke to her. He would sit for hours tracing wax spirals into the table or sitting in corners, whispering toward nothing. When she tried to hold him, he recoiled. "The flame doesn't like you," he said once. "You smell like wet wood." Her days became a blur of worry, grief, and failed attempts to get someone, anyone, to listen. It wasn't until she followed Elijah late one night that she discovered the truth beneath the chapel. It was after midnight when she saw him descend the rebuilt steps into the crypt, his lantern casting twisted shadows against the stones. She waited, then crept in behind him, muffling her steps. The stonework beneath the chapel was ancient, far older than the town itself. Hollow Creek had long ignored rumors of caves beneath the land, of old tunnels used by natives or smugglers or worse. But Sarah now saw the truth. The chapel floor had been rebuilt to serve as a lid to something deeper. a tunnel that led into a long, winding chamber carved with spirals, scorched marks, and strange symbols etched in melted wax. The smell of old candles and singed flesh clung to the walls. Sarah hid in an alcove and watched Elijah descend further, this time with 6 of the children following him in single file, robed and blindfolded. In the center of the chamber was a ring of candles so massive they formed a boundary around, a slab of black stone, upon which rested a 7th child, motionless. Sarah couldn't see clearly, but she recognized the robe. It belonged to Leah Benton. Elijah began chanting, his voice rising and falling in cadences that made the walls vibrate. The children joined in, repeating the angelic tongue. At one point, Elijah placed a candle directly on the child's chest and lit it. The flame burned blue. He held his hands over her and whispered, "Through fire, may the flesh return to the flame. Through ash, may we rise clean." Sarah had to clamp her hand over her mouth to keep from screaming. When it was over, the child was gone. Whether hidden or destroyed, she couldn't tell. The other children turned and walked out slowly, their faces slack, their eyes glazed. Elijah remained behind, staring into the flame. Then, without warning, he turned toward the alcove where Sarah hid and said softly, "You shouldn't be here, Miss Wainsley." But when she fled, breathless and heart-pounding, no one followed her. She tried to rouse the village the next day, but they no longer listened. A fog of belief had settled over them, thick and choking. Elijah's word was the only truth they wanted. Even the blacksmith, Thomas Dale, who had once doubted, had now given himself entirely to the cult. His own niece Elise had vanished, and yet he now helped Elijah gather supplies for the rituals. Sarah realized then that it was too late to reason with them. She needed to save Tobias before he too vanished like smoke. But Tobias would not come willingly. He claimed the light whispered to him now that it needed him, that the others would be waiting. "We're almost done," he said. "Then everything will burn away, and only the clean ones will walk the earth." Sarah wept, begged, even tried to bind his hands one night, but he escaped her and returned to the chapel. The 8th child disappeared a week later. One remained, Tobias, and Sarah knew she had one chance to stop the final act before Elijah completed whatever unholy ritual he had spent the past year constructing. She began planning, gathering herbs, oil, and salt from the old herbalist who still feared God more than man. She returned to the underground crypt one final time and traced the symbols she had seen, comparing them to books in her grandfather's collection. Texts from the old world, warnings of ancient rites that predated Christianity, cults that worshipped fire not as symbol but as God. Elijah wasn't purifying the children. He was feeding them to something ancient, buried beneath Hollow Creek, now awakened by 9 candles, 9 names, 9 little hearts melted into wax and ash. As autumn winds began to howl through the hollows, and the last harvest rotted in the fields, Elijah announced a final ceremony, the Great Cleansing. He said the last of the 9 would be brought before the flame door and offered freely. Sarah watched from the shadows, her heart broken but burning with resolve. She knew she could not stop the cult with words or reason, only with fire of her own. And, as the villagers gathered around the chapel, their faces blank and lit by candlelight, she stepped forward with the torch in her hand, ready to burn down everything, truth, memory, history, before the last child vanished forever into the flames. The first dawn of 1735 broke without birdsong over Hollow Creek, as though nature itself had chosen silence in the face of what was coming, and the sky above the Appalachian ridges sagged heavy with low gray clouds, smothering the hills in a light so dull it made the candles inside the village homes seem like stars in a world with no sun. And on that morning, quiet, trembling, soaked in foreboding, the last remaining child, Tobias Wainsley, was seen walking barefoot toward the chapel ruins, clad in a white robe that dragged behind him like the burial shroud of innocence. His expression vacant, his arms outstretched as though sleepwalking to war. Some invisible altar, and behind him came the villagers. Not in panic, but reverence, walking slowly, heads bowed, lips silently moving in the strange hymnal phrases they had learned from Elijah. Marywood, who stood waiting at the chapel steps with his eternal lantern burning, and a wreath of 9 braided candle wicks slung around his shoulders like a priest's stole, his eyes bright with purpose, his voice already beginning to chant something too old and too vast for the human ear to decipher. And in that slow procession, Sarah Wainsley stood alone in her horror, watching her son lead himself to slaughter beneath the approving nods of neighbors she no longer recognized. Neighbors who had allowed their children to vanish into flame without so much as a whisper of protest. And, as she crouched behind the edge of the carpenter's shed, heart hammering like hooves in her chest, she clutched the satchel pressed tight against her body, the one filled with salt, crushed valerian root, holy oil, and the ancient bone pendant that the herbalist widow, Clara Maddock, had unearthed from the roots of an ash tree said to be older than the founding of the colony itself, a pendant used to sever blood ties and banish ancestral spirits. For this battle would not be one of blade or gunpowder, but of ancient light versus even older darkness. And as she breathed in the cold morning air, she saw smoke rising from the chapel's cracked stones. Not smoke from cooking fires or incense, but black, oily tendrils coiling up like fingers from the crypt beneath the chapel. From the true altar Elijah had carved beneath their feet over the past 2 years, feeding it wax, fear, and the blood-tinged breath of 9 children who had once run laughing through fields now barren. She moved when the crowd had descended into the hollow, slipping along the tree line, ignoring the crunch of frost beneath her boots, her hands shaking but steady with purpose, for she had one goal and one goal alone: to reach her son before the 9th candle was extinguished, before the ritual of the flame door could be completed, for Clara had explained to her in a whispered panic 2 nights earlier that 9 children were not just sacrifices but seals, binding a hunger buried deep below the mountains, an entity without form that only fed on what was innocent and uncorrupted, and that Elijah Marywood, who was not a preacher but a vessel, had not come to Hollow Creek to save souls but to deliver them, his sermons merely the wrapping on a ritual that had begun in other forgotten towns, in other forgotten hills, long before Hollow Creek had even appeared on a map, and that once the 9th child offered himself willingly, the door would open fully and never shut again, not unless someone severed the line of offering and desecrated the sacred space with forbidden symbols and relics, which was exactly what Sarah had in her satchel, gathered at great risk, each item a piece of resistance against something so immense that most would rather believe in fantasy than face the sheer abyss of it. As she slipped through the broken arch of the chapel's rear wall, she was struck at once by the heat rising from the stone, unnatural and suffocating. The scent of melting wax, scorched hair, and something coppery, thick like blood, curdling her throat, and she moved down the stone steps she had once crept along in fear, but now took with unflinching resolve, descending into the crypt that had become a temple of madness, a sanctuary of inversion where the light did not illuminate but blinded, and what she found when she reached the bottom would haunt her for the rest of her days. 9 stone columns encircled the chamber, each with a candle burning on top, except one, Tobias's, which still sat unlit in the center of the circle, placed atop a stone altar slick with something black and pulsing, and surrounding him were the 8 other children. Not dead as she feared, but motionless, blindfolded, their lips moving in soft rargo, rhythmic whispers in that same alien language. Their hands held palm up, as if offering themselves to a god who had never loved them. And there, behind them all, stood Elijah Merwood, his eyes wide and blazing, his arms raised in ecstatic trembling, speaking not to the crowd but to something above, or perhaps below them, something vast and listening. And when he noticed Sarah, he did not shout or strike, but smiled with infinite calm and said, "You came to watch your son become eternal." And she spat at his feet and shouted Tobias's name, but her voice was swallowed by the chamber itself, as though the very stones refused to let her words break the ritual. Still, she moved forward, tearing the pendant from her satchel and holding it aloft, causing Elijah to falter slightly, his smile wavering for the first time in memory, and she poured the oil in a circle around the altar, chanting what Clara had taught her. Words from a tongue older than the colony, older than English, older than Scripture. And the candles around the chamber began to flicker violently, and one by one the blindfolded children began to collapse, not in death, but as if released from a trance, gasping, sobbing, some clawing at their robes, others staring in confusion at their surroundings. And Elijah, furious now, screamed words that cracked the air like thunder, causing stones to tremble and dust to fall from the crypt ceiling. And from the black altar a hand emerged, thin, brittle, bone-like, wrapped in flame that did not burn but shimmered with unnatural cold. And Sarah knew, in that instant, that she was not fighting Elijah but the thing behind him, the thing through him. And with her last ounce of strength she hurled the pendant into the blackness pooling on the altar. And there came a scream. Not from Elijah, not from the children, but from the stones themselves, from the bones beneath the land, a shriek that shattered one of the columns and extinguished every candle but one, Tobias's, which now glowed not with fire, but with a cool blue light. And in that light the hand on the altar withered, cracked, and burst into ash. Elijah staggered, blood pouring from his mouth, his lantern finally extinguishing as he fell to his knees, staring at Sarah not with rage but disbelief, whispering, "You broke the cycle," before collapsing beside the altar, his body crumbling into wax and bone, leaving behind only his scorched Bible, which fluttered open to a page that bore no words, only the outline of a candle snuffed out by a single fingerprint of soot. And in the silence that followed, Sarah ran to her son, who looked up at her with eyes that slowly filled with recognition and horror, and she held him, rocking him, as the remaining children crawled toward the steps. And outside, the chapel began to crack, stone by stone, as if the very foundation rejected the absence of the thing it once contained. She led them all out just as the roof began to cave, and behind her the crypt collapsed in a scream of stone and dust, sealing forever. Or so she prayed, the thing they had nearly unleashed, and for days after the collapse the village remained still, silent, broken by the weight of what had been done, and though some tried to rebuild, the land itself refused to allow it. The ground forever scorched where the chapel had stood. The trees around it withered, and in time the story was buried, spoken only in whispers. The children moved far away, Sarah never speaking of it again, not even to Tobias, who would grow up quiet, kind, and never again touch a candle for the rest of his life. And it was not until 1887, when a group of rail surveyors unearthed the buried remains of the chapel wall while clearing land, that the story reemerged. 9 charred, child-sized impressions in stone, a scorched lantern, and a Bible too warped to read, prompting scholars and priests to investigate the forgotten town of Hollow Creek, though few records remained, and none could explain the melted wax veins in the soil or the faint, sweet scent of burnt sugar that still lingered in the earth where the altar had once stood, and the only surviving account of the event, a single torn page found beneath the altar stone, simply read, "The light remembers, but the shadow forgets nothing."